cops? What is the most "what on earth happened here" moment you've experienced so far? As a rookie deputy, I received a call about a man who had gotten his foot caught in a garden tiller. It was a 20-minute drive, running code, so I used the time to plan my actions. I figured the ambulance would arrive about 10 minutes behind me, so my plan was to apply a tourniquet above the knee and prepare for the possibility. When I arrived, I found a large farm building and two men standing outside, looking like ghosts as they smoked and pointed inside. I grabbed my medic bag, though I wasn't a medic. It contained a tourniquet, some cervical collars, gauze, and other supplies, and I ran towards them, asking where the patient was. They simply pointed behind them. Inside, I saw a PTO-driven tiller, about 7 feet wide and 3 feet tall, and there was my patient. He was sitting against the tractor tire. When he looked up at me and asked, "Can you help me?" I was overwhelmed. At 21 years old, I had expected to deal with a simple garden tiller, but I was completely out of my element. In the end, we had two ambulances, the rural fire department's extraction team, a welding company to take the machine apart on site, a helicopter, and a surgeon who came to help. After all that, he was finally freed. Anyone hearing this story will probably pass out. Can't imagine what it must have been like to be there. Also, how much does something like this cost? Story 2. I spent some time as a cop on the reservation and encountered my fair share of strange situations. One night while driving around, I got a call from dispatch where a UFO was spotted in one of the farmers' fields. Curious, I headed to the farmer's house. We knew each other, and he didn't seem too loony, so I thought maybe there was something to this. When I turned my spotlight onto the field, I saw something metallic that definitely didn't look right. Trying to suppress my nerves, I made my way through the furrows. It was an autumn night, the wind howling and clouds swirling overhead. I kept one hand on my holstered weapon and the other shining my flashlight, rehearsing my lines for our new extraterrestrial visitors. As I got closer, my brain finally functioned, and I realized that I was looking at a bunch of mylar balloons. They were blown up and caught in some grass, around 20 of them just chilling there and scaring me out. I gathered the balloons and walked back to the farmer, who burst out laughing. I couldn't help but join in. After handing them over, I got back in my squad, still a bit shaken. Sadly, the farmer passed away a few years ago, and his family gave me those deflated balloons he had kept. I have them stored in my basement now. I used to work as a cop on the Sisseton-Wahpeton Reservation in South Dakota, and I loved every second of it, from playing stoop with the kids where we'd sit on someone's front steps and snack, to finding all sorts of loopholes to help people out. I miss it, but it wasn't conducive to family life. And he probably told that story 100 times, and it gave him a lot of laughs, which is some pretty good stuff to have in your back pocket when you need it. Story 3. As a former member of the U.S. Coast Guard, I had my fair share of tough weeks, but one in particular stands out from my time in the Carolinas. Due to shallow waters and shifting sand, the intracoastal waterway, the ICW in our region, required regular adjustments to the buoys, often nearly every month, to accurately mark the best channels for navigation. During this week, a large 700-foot cargo ship, which had not updated its nautical charts for its autopilot, navigated down the ICW. Over several hundred miles, it managed to run over or displace more than 320 buoys, dayboards, and lights, including an entire rear range, a 75-foot tall structure with a large light. With the channels poorly marked due to the inaccurate or missing aids to navigation, the ATON, we responded to over 100 hard aground calls from boaters that week. This included everything from sailboats and jet skis to fishing trawlers and even an entire ferry that ended up halfway up the beach. The ferry struck a sandbar at over 25 knots while carrying hundreds of senior citizens, which meant we had to medevac people via helicopter and boats to waiting ambulances for the better part of 4 hours. We ran 16 to 20-hour boat cruise shifts every single day for about 9 days straight. At least we racked up our required towing evolution hours for that quarter, and then some. The shipping company was found at fault, and the U.S. government sent them a bill in the 8-figure range. It cost around $10,000 just to get some of the larger cutters underway and about $30,000 to launch some of the helicopters from the Elizabeth City Air Station. Story 4. One time, we got a call about a small wreck on a highway corridor. When we arrived, I began handling the accident, but I noticed a car on flat tires about 100 yards down the road and another one further along. They weren't related to the accident. One of the drivers walked back to us, mentioning that a sketchy guy had been stopping at these cars offering to help fix the flats. The theory was that he had thrown something on the road to flatten the tire so he could help and then ask for money from the drivers. While I was stuck at the back end of this mess trying to get another unit to detain the shady guy, I suddenly glanced over and saw a man in nothing but a hospital gown with an IV hanging out of his arm, just strolling along the shoulder. The nearest hospital was several miles away, so I had no idea how he covered that distance without anyone noticing. Here I was, dealing with a car wreck, a guy possibly flattening tires on purpose, and an escaped hospital patient, all completely unrelated incidents on a major highway late at night. Story 5. In Canada, police officers also serve as crime scene examiners, unlike in many other countries where this role is filled by civilians. On a typical Canadian November day with temperatures hovering between -5 to -10 degrees Celsius and the air crisp and clear, I received a call regarding a suspicious sudden loss of life. I was informed that a man had been found in his living room and the circumstances appeared dubious. Upon arrival, I met with the patrol officer who had discovered it. He explained that a concerned neighbor had requested a welfare check on the elderly gentleman. When the officer arrived, he knocked and rang the doorbell, but there was no response. After checking the perimeter, he noticed the man unconscious in his living room through a window. The officer, accompanied by a backup unit, enters through the front door, revealing the scene, a man lying in the middle of the living room, surrounded by a pool of red liquid and bearing obvious trauma to his head, indicative of an injury. The patrol officer led me to the side of the house where I found a weapon leaning against the wall, accompanied by red liquid spatter. This evidence initially suggested that the man had been harmed outside. However, something felt off. As I meticulously examined the scene, I found no red liquid trail leading from the side into the house. If the man had been harmed outside and then moved inside, there should have been some evidence of red liquid along the way. But there was none, just a singular pool of red liquid at his head and no spatter elsewhere in the house. The more I investigated, the more it started to look like a crime rather than ending one's life. It seemed implausible for someone to sustain such a serious injury, drag themselves into the house without leaving a trail. An assailant could easily conceal their actions, but an injured party wouldn't have the strength to move without leaving evidence behind. As I became increasingly meticulous, I checked the grass for any signs of proof, scrutinized the shrubs for broken branches, and searched the concrete tiles for footprints. I even fingerprinted doorknobs and windows, but found nothing unusual. To gain further insight, I called for a consultation with 2 senior non-commissioned officers, one of whom specialized in sample analysis. They joined me at the scene, but after examining the evidence, they too were perplexed. And while waiting for guidance, I suddenly remembered a standard procedure that I had overlooked, the indirect hemistics test, a presumptive test for red liquid. This test uses a yellow strip that changes to dark green in the presence of red liquid. I took a sample of the pooled substance around the injured person's head, eager to confirm it was red liquid. However, to my astonishment, the hemistics did not react. Thinking perhaps the strips were expired, I grabbed a new container from my van and confirmed its expiration date before testing a fresh strip. Still negative. At this point, I gathered the 2 NCOs and demonstrated the test for them. They exchanged stunned looks. There was no logical explanation for why the red liquid wasn't triggering a reaction. I contacted the lab for further clarification, but they were equally stumped. I escalated the situation to our headquarters in Ottawa, speaking with a research scientist who provided valuable insights. It turned out that the person had not been an ordinary individual. He had been in poor health, suffering from chronic pain and various health issues that had driven him to contemplate and end his life. One of the medications he was taking was known to cause false negative reactions in red liquid reagent testing. Additionally, this medication could significantly lower BP, especially in colder temperatures. The unfortunate truth emerged. The old man had ventured outside with a weapon, intending to end it all, hoping that someone would hear him and call for help. This explained the red liquid stains on the side of the house. However, he misfired and inflicted a non-fatal wound, resulting in a delayed loss of life. In the cold, he lost consciousness from the pain, and the combined effects of his medication and low temperatures slowed his circulation. The wound partially clotted, preventing immediate bleeding. After regaining consciousness, he managed to stumble back into the house, locking the door behind him and collapsing on the living room floor. Once inside, the ambient warmth of the house likely increased his circulation and BP. We later uncovered a note he had written, further validating his intentions. Story 6. This happened to my friend on his first day of work. So he was driving with his partner. Normally, we don't have partners, but for the first 6 months when you start, you are paired up. Also, we have community volunteers, which are like unarmed but trained individuals who assist the peace officer. So there are 3 people in total. He's driving down a highway when we saw a man on the side of the road near an entrance to an access road for a cottage. The man has no clothes on and is covered in red liquid and pointing down the access road trying to get their attention. Lights on, drive along the road. The man is waving at them, and as soon as they stop, he simply hops into the trees and begins to run beside the road. They adhere to it. They went to a cottage and the door is open. They turn to look at the man who has no clothes on and he's gone, vanished into the woods. There's also visibly red liquid all over the door and deck. Supervisor gets out, goes into the trunk, gets the weapon, and gives it to the unarmed, saying something like, "Cover our back and try not to harm us. We're going in." He and my friend draw their weapon and go. When they get inside, there's red liquid everywhere, like from a movie, all over the walls, furniture, just everywhere. Entering the living room, there's a man on the couch with a couple of wounds, but he's alert and seems actually not that bad, but he's holding a dog on a leash. "If you let that dog go, it's the end," says the supervisor. Guy ties the leash to the side of the couch, puts his hands up, but doesn't say a word. "Is anyone here? What happened? Are you okay?" He didn't say a word. They place him under arrest and take him to the car. They continue searching upstairs, clearing rooms out until they get to one of the bedrooms. They look in and there is a guy under some covers but still obviously awake. "Show me your hands." The guy hears them, throws the blanket off to reveal he is also exposed, hurt, and basically about to collapse from red liquid loss. Paramedics came and the house was fully cleared out. As it turns out, the 3 men, including the exposed force man, were all dealers just having a get-together. They started their bad habits, and after getting really odd, it turned into a bit sassy. In a moment of lucidity, one of the dealers realized he wasn't into men and grabbed a weapon, which escalated into a sassy fight, hence all the red liquid. To think that was just day 1. Story 7. My father is a retired police officer. He always shares funny stories and is a natural jokester and is a great storyteller. I grew up hearing his hilarious cop stories. It wasn't until I was older that I realized that there was no way that every day was a funny story. So I asked him one day about the calls that he doesn't share with us, the tough calls. He got quiet and his eyes changed. He said, "Do you really want to hear about what it's like to see poor children?" That's when I realized that my father has carried these experiences with him for decades. There's a reason why he's concerned when I travel alone for business. There's a reason he faces a door and knows the exits at a restaurant. My father has encountered the worst in this world. I never asked him about the tough calls ever again. Story 8. This is my uncle's story. Not a cop, but the call was sent to the fire department instead due to the strangeness. The truck was sent on a call for an unknown situation, which basically means anything in the world. They get sent an address and that's pretty much it. Truck drives down the street looking for this address and they get to the end and all they see is an abandoned lot with nothing but bushes. Even though they can't see anyone, they have to get out anyway and investigate, so my uncle and a couple of the guys get out of the truck and start walking around with the usual "fire department, call out." They didn't hear anything for a while and were about to pack it in as another pointless prank call when my uncle walked past a bush and heard rustling. He looks over and sees a man standing kind of awkwardly behind a bush. "Hey, Mr. Fireman." "Did you call 911?" my uncle asked. Yes, sir." My uncle steps a bit closer and realizes how the man is completely exposed and standing at a strange angle. He motions to another firefighter that he found the caller and goes behind the bush to begin assessing he is a firefighter and a paramedic. That's when he realizes that the man has a bunny tail on his bottom. Of course, they try to get the man to explain why he had called in distress and what was going on. After a bit of avoidance, the man finally admits that my uncle honestly had no idea why anyone would think this is a good idea generally. Being the enlightened individual that he is, he chose one with a holder on the end to hang up in a bathroom. What my uncle and the other firefighters assumed was that the holder had stuck on something internally because they couldn't pull it out, and it caused the man significant discomfort when they tried. My uncle left the man with another firefighter, got information, and went back to the truck to call for an ambulance. Of course, at this point, he always mentions that he walked around the truck to see the rest of the company trying to silently end one's life of laughter out of view of the bushes. When the ambulance arrives, my uncle meets them with a grin on his face and tells them to brace themselves before walking them over to the bushes. They assess the man and conclude that there is no way for them to remove the toilet brush in the field, and that they have to bring him to the hospital for surgery. The only problem was that they couldn't figure out how to get him into the gurney without causing him to move in a way that caused him even more pain. They end up throwing a blanket over him, and the firefighters help maneuver him into a sort of downward position with his bottom in the air to keep the toilet brush at the right angle. At that point, my uncle decided that the fire department was done with the call and the paramedics could handle it from there, and loaded up the company onto the truck. As they began to drive away, he said, "They were loading this guy into the rig as we drove off, and the last I saw him was that blanket falling off and that bunny tail of his sticking straight up in the air." My uncle did follow up on this call with a friend at the hospital. The brush was removed surgically due to the holder getting stuck on something internally and causing the man to have some serious health complications. He has way more stories due to being a working firefighter since he was a teenager in Southern California, and he's 62 years old today. Story 9. I used to be a cop, and one day I was sent off to a home invasion crime in progress. Once I arrived, I entered the house with several people ranging from senior citizens to young children. They said in Spanish that the homeowner was in one of the bedrooms and that he got off some weapons at the defendant. I went to that bedroom, and just inside the door was an adult male. I rolled him over, and he was obviously not moving. On the other side of the room was the homeowner. He was still alive and had also been harmed multiple times, but none were fatal. He was still clucking his empty weapon. He kept saying, "I got them." Apparently what had happened was that the whole family was in the living room when 4 defendants entered through the front door. The homeowner said he ran to his room to get his weapon to defend himself as they were coming in. He said he had to load it, so while they had the family, he hid in the room. After a few minutes had passed, the defendant and the others started searching rooms. He said when they got to him, he stood up and they opened fire on each other. The homeowner said 4 people opened at him and he didn't know how many he struck. He said he didn't know he got one at first, but when he tried to chase the defendant as he ran out, he collapsed. He was struck multiple times and in different areas. The guy was lucky and he survived the incident. He had actually struck all 4 defendants. One collapsed and the others showed up at 2 different hospitals about an hour later. The men didn't wear masks, so the family was able to identify them. They got life in prison. I personally think they were going to end everyone's life, and that is the reason they didn't wear masks. They chose that specific house because it was harvest season, and they had hundreds of pounds of processed grass in different stages of packaging on the property. Some were hanging to dry in a barn. Some were in a big pile broken up in a bedroom, and the rest was already packaged in shipping boxes ready to be moved. When this happened, recreational grass wasn't legal yet. The homeowner grew it for a medical dispensary, but it was way over what he was allowed to grow. Story 10. I was a passerby during a public argument between 2 strangers. I passed before the police rolled in. What I witnessed was a foreigner trying to fight with a Greek vendor. They started throwing each other around. People step in to separate them, but they won't let each other go. One guy loses his clothes, the other guy is trying to hurt him. A young girl rushes in with a chair and breaks it off to anyone who tries to separate them. An older grandma throws her shoes at them. The guy who was harmed by a chair tries to get revenge and throws back the shoes. The younger girl takes her shoe off and appeals for revenge, while the grandma runs over and causes harm. Yikes! Looks like the family Olympics with grandma claiming gold in the shoe tossing event. And then the guy tries to retaliate, but let's be real, how do you outshoe a determined grandma, even with that younger girl? She seems like she's just fueled with fire while grandma's already bringing the pain like a seasoned pro. Whatever happens in Greece, man. Story 11. Not a cop, but I have a story. So a couple of years ago, I was in a fender bender. I'm driving down our small town main road late at night on the way home. Small town, so to keep noise down at night, all the traffic lights along the main road are set to green as default and red to the sides, so that big trucks don't have to stop and use their noisy brakes. I'm tired after a long drive, so I'm cruising at speed limit, green lights all the way for me, when out of nowhere, a car suddenly comes screaming into the intersection ahead of me, leaving me with no time to even react. I T-bone them at an angle as they're entering the main road at quite a speed and ricochet off. My car spins around twice on the slightly damp road before coming to a stop without damaging anything else. The other car doesn't even slow down and keeps driving on, leaving me sitting there feeling like I'm that random innocent car that always gets hurt in a movie when the villain makes his escape. Skip ahead until the authorities arrive. Cop gets out of his car, sees only my car that's almost apart and absolutely no damage to anything anywhere else. He looks me up and down, sees red liquid rushing down from destroying my rearview mirror, and goes, "What on earth happened here? What did you damage?" Some questions later, while the medics are putting a bandage around my head, the other car arrives with only small damage. The cop must have seen the relief on my face as the other driver walked over and explained that his wife was going into labor and he had to get her to the hospital. While we were busy at the scene, she gave birth to a beautiful, healthy baby girl with no complications. He then left quickly to come and explain, and he even showed us pictures of his newborn on his phone. I didn't press charges, and his insurance paid for fixing my car and my medical bills. The cop's face was epic, though. Didn't think it would be necessary, but some clarification. This was in South Africa. They didn't have medical, so calling an ambulance would have cost them a small fortune. The guy said he saw me getting out and waving my arms around after the accident, so he knew I was fine. Apparently, they also didn't think it was a bad accident since they were still driving. Yes, it was his mistake, but he had his family to think of. I would probably have done the same thing, and the hospital was literally 2 blocks away anyway. Yeah, he messed up, but me pressing charges after an honest accident would only shatter his new family. Besides, no one got seriously injured and his insurance covered all the damages, so no harm was done in the end. And if you're enjoying the video so far, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 12. So we wanted to talk to this guy who had a history of offenses and had allegedly approached children in the town center. He was living out of a van which had been in the same spot for a couple of months. I'd never seen the van myself. It was just known by others that it was there. 2 others went to where he was approaching kids, and 2 of us went to see if he was in his van. It was an old rusty POS with windows on the sides and back. Note that this guy definitely lived alone. The front windscreen had bottom half blocked with bottles, top half blocked with women's clothes draped across the top. The side window is broken but shattered outwards. Other side and rear window is smeared with honey on the inside based on the empty honey jars we could see. The insides were floors completely covered in women's clothing and had a lot of sanitary towels scattered around, sparkly high heels in a children's size. In the center of it all, 2 raw pork chops with no packaging just sitting there in the middle of the floor. I can get the bottled cans and women's clothing, presumably a person with bad habits with some kind of cross-dressing habit. Not exactly ordinary, but far from the weirdest thing I've seen. But why was the window shattered outwards? Why are shoes in a child's size? Why would you smear honey on the inside of the window? And why would you have a raw pork chop in the middle of your van? Never did I ever find out the answers to those questions. It all got passed on to a different team. Not sure I want to know, given the guy's history, and I don't even want to say what my guesses would be. Story 13. Not a cop, but I was there in the aftermath and years later when the rest of the story came out. When I was in my first year of college, my girlfriend had a roommate who was dating a highway patrolman. One night, we were lounging around watching TV at her place when he unexpectedly pulled up in his patrol car, something he never did, as the car usually stayed at his home. He came in, collapsed on the couch, and mumbled 199, just 199, over and over. After a while, he got over the shakes and told us what happened. He was sitting on a stretch of the highway nicknamed Snakeback as it had lots of hills on this 20-mile straightaway. They would sit in the bottom of the hills and catch speeders as you couldn't see the car until you topped the hill right before it. Pop speeders with radar and wait on the next one. Well, he was sitting there when the radar went off displaying 199. That was the highest reading his radar unit could show. He looks around, clears the reading, and lays it back on the dash, 199. Picks up the weapon and aims it down the road, 199. He's about to start the diagnostic test because there has got to be something wrong with the unit. The whole car shakes, trees are moving, and he messes with himself. All he saw was a blue streak. He didn't call it in or anything. What would I say? Hey, there's a blue streak coming your way at 200 miles per hour? He just came to see us as we were the closest people he knew. After about an hour and a smoke, he got up to finish his shift. 2.5 years later, I'm with a friend who was a pilot at the local airport. One of his buddies went to tell his favorite story. He was flying back from a trip in his Cessna back then and saw a cop sitting on the highway in the same spot he had gotten a ticket and decided to steep dive. He took his blue Cessna balls to the wall, dive bomb style, right at him, laughing all the way to the airport. When I shared the first part of the story, he doubled over with laughter. Oh, small world, quick demise. Story 14. This isn't exactly on subject, but a funny story. I was a military police officer in the Army. Adjacent to our base was an open field owned by the Army but uncontrolled. One dark night, a van and a car went to the far end of the field. One person gets out of the car, gets into the van. Lights are on in the van, but it's too far to see what's going on. We thought it was something bad, like a deal or something similar. Lights go out in the van, we blocked the exit, approached on foot, shined our flashlights all at once in the windows. Gotcha. The young daughter of the base commander on her back with a guy. After a lot of laughter and embarrassment, we told them this field was always watched and that they would never be undisturbed there. Over the next year, the following scene played out a dozen or more times. I'm on duty at the base gate. Van approaches. He's driving. She's in the passenger seat. I motion for them to stop, but then recognize the two of them, smile, and wave them through. He smiles and waves. She curls into a ball and hides her face. Story 15. Not a cop at all, but my grandpa was in the FBI in the 60s to the 80s and has some interesting stories he's told me. Back in the day, there was a wanted man who they had been trying to find for a while. They knew where he lived, but every time they would check to see if he was at his apartment, there was never any signs of him. He lived far away from the city in a relatively rural area of Texas. One day, my grandpa was off duty and was in the area, and I'm not sure why, he decided to check on it, not expecting anything to come of it. The guy wasn't known to be threatening, so my grandpa didn't think much of going to check on the house. He went up to the door and knocked. The door opened up after a little, and behold, it's the guy they're looking for, standing right in front of him with a weapon in his hand. I don't remember exactly what happened since I was told this story a while ago, but he managed to disarm the guy and get him cuffed. The guy didn't resist and later claimed that he was practicing his quick draw. After my grandpa got him into handcuffs, he put the weapon on top of the refrigerator in the room, assuming the wanted guy was the only person in the apartment. My grandpa started taking the guy out of the apartment to his car. As he was reaching the door, he heard a yell from behind him. His girlfriend had been in the apartment the whole time, and when he turned around, she had grabbed the weapon from the top of the fridge and demanded that he let the guy go. So instead of letting him go, Grandpa used the guy as a shield and told her to put the weapon down. She refused, so he approached her with her boyfriend in between them for protection. He got close enough to the girlfriend and subsequently cuffed her too. The whole time, the wanted guy was pleading with the girlfriend to stop and didn't struggle against my grandpa. My grandpa only took the wanted guy because they were far from the city. I don't remember if he went back for the girlfriend later or if he got back up to do it. Story 16. I'm actually a security officer for a downtown bus station. The station is home to a lot of homeless people, the less fortunate, and plenty of troublemakers. We usually know all of the troublemakers by first name because we deal with them on a regular basis. So anyways, I made a deposit for the bus station and noticed a person asleep on the bench inside the lobby. Usually this isn't a big deal, but that would mean that I would have to wake him up later when I returned. Unluckily this day, we had a troublemaker hanging around. Now most people think that we deal with common dealers and groups at this bus station, which is true. However, we do live near a rural area with lots and lots of poor conservatives, so several of our troublemakers are also old, angry white men and sovereign citizens. Anyways, as I returned from the deposit to see several cop cars pulled up and a guy getting frisked on one of the windows. So I went over to the cops and asked them what was going on. As it turns out, someone called the police on the man claiming he was intoxicated. I noticed that the man was the same guy who was asleep in my lobby just earlier, so I asked the cops if the guy was intoxicated. Turns out he was not. So I asked who made the call. Turns out it was a citizen who raised some concerns about a guy being inebriated on property. The bus station didn't call him in and didn't even know what happened. Well, turns out the cops told me it was a guy named Robert, our resident sovsiv. Robert is a whiny sovsiv who really likes to tattle on people and make up outlandish stories about him getting robbed. If any of you remember Randall from Disney, Recess, this is him in his older form. So I asked the cops if they would be willing to talk to Robert and give him a lesson. They said nope. I pulled Robert aside and asked him if he called the police on the guy. Robert said he did and he would do it again if needed. So I had to warn Robert that he was not the law at the bus station. He needed to tell me or the dispatchers if there was a problem and not to take measures into his own hands. Robert got pissed. He started to use foul language at me and walked towards me saying that I wasn't an authority over him. I finally had enough and pointed at the door. I told him to leave for the day or I would have him trespassed and taken into custody. He got the message and sulked under a tree across the street until we closed. Story 17. This is the only unsolved mystery I've handled that has continued to bother me. The prior shift had been receiving tons of 911 hang-up calls that's being pinged to a general area with an open line on callback. The calls continued into our shifts every so often. We canvassed the area of the call, knocked on a few doors, checked cell phones, nothing. I started calling the number back on my personal phone and would answer to an open line. I started hearing general outdoor noises that I was hearing real time, like cars and birds. I started my siren and was hearing my own siren through the call. Long story short, we managed to pinpoint the area of the call by making noises to this new pickup truck parked in a driveway. First, we were thinking maybe a Bluetooth or OnStar type error was making the calls. We checked, nothing. We actually start pounding on the truck and we can tell that the noise is being picked up from the rear tailgate area of this truck. We looked all around this vehicle and still found nothing. We kept calling and the device kept answering and we could literally hear our own voices through the call by standing at the rear of this vehicle. We could not hear ourselves from the interior of the truck, so it wasn't a device on the inside of the cab. Eventually, we had to give up and move on with our lives. The device stopped making 911 calls and eventually stopped answering calls. The lady just bought the truck a week ago, neatly brand new with only a few thousand miles. I had a crazy theory that someone was tracking either the previous or the current owner with some kind of phone GPS device that they hid in the remains of the truck. That's literally the only thing I could think of that would create this kind of scenario. Story 18. Former police officer here. I got called out to a motorbike crash. A guy was riding and a car took a U-turn while without looking. Biker was generally okay, called an ambulance as precaution and checked over insurance. Biker was riding with a few friends when the accident happened and asked if we were happy for them to recover the bike to save us calling for recovery, as one of them had a truck and trailer. We were fine with that and the biker went to get his truck. It must have been 5 minutes going by when a bus pulled over at our scene, a woman shouting to us that there had been an accident on the next road along. As we were 2 units, my colleague and I left the first scene to go to this new accident literally 300 meters away on a side country road. We turn the corner, pull up, and see an awfully familiar motorbike break into a lorry. It was our first biker friend. In his rush to help recover his friend's bike, he got into an accident with a lorry and ended up much worse off than his friend. To make matters worse, his bike was also a write-off and he ended up in much worse condition than his friend. Story 19. I'm not a cop, but I'm a med student and used to volunteer for the ambulance. We got called to an emergency in a nearby village. We went there and found a family. A father is holding his young daughter in his arms. Anyway, our doctor took her out to put her down, and when he tried to examine her, I saw things I haven't seen before. I thought I was going crazy for a second. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. I couldn't handle it anymore. I felt lightheaded, almost like I was going to pass out, so I went back to hide in the ambulance. Our unit sat there for 40 minutes doing CPR while police officers came also. When the guys finally came back, they all looked like they'd seen a ghost. I apologized for leaving and asked if I'm stable or if I'm imagining. He explained to me what happened, and I asked him why they even did CPR. If that was the case, she was long gone before we even got there. And his answer was, look, no one is going to forget this day, ever. We see a lot of this, but this is one of the most odd by a long margin. And you're right, she was DOA. Today, we couldn't save anyone, but at least we could comfort her family. Those people didn't need to know that the girl was lifeless and we couldn't do anything about it. They just needed to know that we did everything we could to try and save her. They will probably be hurt forever by what happened today, but at least they might have some peace seeing us trying to save her. At the end of the day, we can at least save the people who are still alive. As for what happened, in this village there was a tradition that people would go on top of a hill at night every summer and roll stuff off objects from the top of the hill. Some kind of tradition for good luck from a long time ago. They were throwing away their bad luck. Anyway, it looks like it was a day before this would happen, and in the middle of the day, a group of kids rolled a tire up the hill to play like the event, and they rolled it off the hill. At the bottom of this certain hill was this family's house. When the tire got to the bottom of the hill, it was so fast that it jumped over the fence inside their garden where the poor girl was playing alone. Story 20. I was a deputy assigned to the jail. I'm working on a picture and printed them when I walked past one of our holding tanks and saw a teenager in the holding tank doing what I can only assume is his version of an African tribal dance. The other inmates in the holding tank see me and start yelling to get them out of there. I call 2 other deputies and an officer down there and have them open that tank and the one next to it. The other inmates couldn't get out there fast enough. Once the other inmates were secure, the 2 other deputies and I tried to talk to the guy, but he charged us. All 3 of us sprayed him with OCPD. He just stopped and stared at us. It's supposed to temporarily blind you, makes it hard to breathe, and stings where it touches. The other two deputies then take a step to subdue him, but I holler for the holding tank door to be immediately closed. They protested, saying there's just one of him and he's a skinny kid. I pointed at him and told them, that skinny kid is playing off with OC. He ain't feeling no pain. We need more guys. We stacked up 8 men, and even then it still took us a good 5 to 10 minutes of fighting. Of course, most of us were coughing and hurting afterward, but I learned the local junior college PD was the one that brought him in, and we're still in the building filling the reports. I found them and told them I knew they never had more than 3 guys on shift at any time, and it just took all 8 of us to get control of that kid. How'd they do it? The sergeant looked at me with a grin and said, I pinned him down. Apparently, it's grass dipped in fluid. Craziest fight I ever had. Story 21. I was a military police officer a few years back in North Carolina. We were sent off to a disorderly conduct call between an employee and a female patron at the PX, which is the base department store for the uninitiated. At the time, these were fairly common calls since military wives have a tendency to hurt other women, especially on base. We pulled up to the back of the building near the manager's entrance where the 2 subjects were reported to be at. We're expecting to see 2 people arguing, but instead we see a very baffled-looking store worker standing outside and a very long trail of women's clothes leading from the sidewalk all the way into the wood line behind the building. We speak with the employee who tells us that some lady had come to the customer service desk demanding to speak with the manager, and after being told to wait for a few minutes, went out behind the store to the employee parking lot, starting screaming at some random employees in the area and started walking over into the woods while, you guessed it, exposed. We end up getting a few more military police on scene, including our female sergeant, to start canvassing the wood line for this lady. We also went ahead and got EMS there as well, since we know we're probably looking for an EDP. After about 5 minutes or so of walking through the woods, our sergeant ends up finding the lady sitting exposed on a tree branch singing Barbie Girl, acting like she doesn't have a care in the world. We ended up talking her down from the tree and getting her into the ambulance to take with the paramedics. We also contacted her husband and were able to get him there as well as a few minutes later. The husband tells us that she has a long history of mental illness and that he was trying to convince her to see a therapist. They ended up taking her to the mental ward at the Naval Hospital to get treated. Never heard any more about it afterwards, but I hope she got the help that she needed. Story 22. I'm not a cop, but my grandfather was an officer in the Air Force at a base in Okinawa. While watching Hacksaw Ridge, we reached the scene where a guy gets a sharp weapon thrown through his foot in the barracks. I commented, "How could you be so foolish?" And my grandfather began to share his own story. One day, he received a call from a subordinate about a situation in on-base housing. They wanted to handle it discreetly without turning it into a big ordeal. My grandfather said he'd be down right away, and when he arrived, he found a guy wounded with a weapon surrounded by some of his friends. The story went that the guy was practicing throwing by chucking a weapon between his feet. As you can imagine, he missed and sent a weapon straight through. While my grandfather was getting the details, one of the guy's friends tried to pull the weapon out. Luckily, he was stopped just in time. As far as I know, my grandfather got the guy medical attention, and I believe he made a full recovery. Alright, if any of these stories got to you, here's more. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video, and thanks for hanging with me on this one.